September 15th, 2008. Lehman Brothers collapses. The stock market is in free fall and everyone is panicking. Boomers are freaking out. Millennials are spiraling. Financial experts are on TV having actual breakdowns. But there was this one generation that just didn't. Generation X, the forgotten middle children born between 1965 and 1980, watched their 401s crater, their home values collapse, their secured jobs vanish, and their reaction was basically, yeah, saw that coming. In fact, Gen X is logging into their retirement accounts and increasing their contributions, not because they're cynical, but because they've been psychologically preparing for this exact moment since they were 8 years old. What everyone forgets, 2008 wasn't Gen X's first financial apocalypse. It was their third. And by the third time the system betrays you, you stop panicking and start calculating. The way Gen X handled 2008 reveals the most psychologically resilient financial mindset of any generation. Rewind to this moment. It's October 19th, 1987. You're young, 7, 17, 22, it doesn't matter. Your dad comes home from work and his face is gray. The stock market dropped 22% in a single day, the largest one-day crash in history. You watch your parents' anxiety. You absorb their fear. You learn that markets can collapse without warning. Flash forward to March 2000. You're now in your 20s and 30s. The dot-com bubble bursts. Companies worth billions become worthless overnight. Friends at startups are suddenly unemployed. The NASDAQ loses 78% over 2 years. You learn that sure things don't exist. But here's what really shaped Gen X. You watched your parents' generation get betrayed by the corporate promise. Dad worked at the same company for 25 years, counting on that pension. The company declared bankruptcy, and it evaporated. Mom's colleague at IBM got walked out with a cardboard box at 55. No warning, no safety net. By 2008, you had learned the fundamental truth. Systems can't be trusted, institutions will betray you, and the only person who'll save you is you. So when Lehman Brothers collapsed, Gen X wasn't shocked. They were vindicated. Here's what psychologists call it: defensive pessimism. You assume everything will go wrong, so you prepare obsessively. By the time disaster strikes, you're not panicking. You're executing the plan you've been rehearsing for 30 years. While everyone else was optimistic about the housing market, Gen X was squirreling away 6 to 12 months of expenses. Not because they're smarter, because they watched the 1990s recession hit their parents without warning. They remembered the gas lines from the 1970s. According to Transamerica Center for Retirement Studies, Gen X had the highest emergency fund rates of any generation entering 2008. When the crash hit, that paranoia became the difference between forced selling and strategic buying. If you lose your job, but have a year's expenses saved, you don't liquidate your 401k at the bottom. If you have a side hustle running, you have income when pink slips come. If you've been managing your own portfolio, you're not listening to the panic on CNBC. Gen X wasn't lucky in 2008. They were prepared. And there's a massive psychological difference between those two things. Here's what happens when you live through multiple crashes. You start recognizing the pattern. Markets crash and markets recover. It's not faith, it's data. Gen Xers in 2008 were between 28 and 43 years old. They'd seen Black Monday recover. They'd seen the dot-com crash recover. They understood something crucial. Crashes are buying opportunities if you can avoid forced selling. Federal Reserve data shows that Gen X maintained and often increased their 401k contribution rates during 2008 to 2009. While boomers reduced contributions by 2.3% and millennials pulled back entirely, Gen X stayed the course or doubled down. Why? Because they'd done the math. They'd built the spreadsheets. And the spreadsheets said, if you're 20 to 30 years from retirement and the market is down 50%, you're buying stocks on sale. The deeper psychology, they trusted their own analysis more than the experts. And 2008 proved they were right. Let's talk about something Gen X had been doing since the 1990s, managing their own money. Not because they're financial geniuses, because they watched their parents trust experts with pensions that disappeared. Cerulli Associates found Gen X had the lowest rates of traditional financial advisor usage of any generation. They were reading books, building spreadsheets, teaching themselves about index funds and asset allocation. When 2008 hit, this paid off massively. While financial advisors were recommending panic selling, Gen X was running their own numbers, looking at P/E ratios and historical recovery timelines, making decisions based on data, not emotion. There's a comment that captures this. I have my spreadsheets that I review daily. We manage our own investments. I'm not paying someone who doesn't know more than me. That wasn't arrogance. That was survival instinct. And in 2008, it meant the difference between selling at the bottom and buying at the bottom. Here's something else Gen X had been doing quietly: building backup income streams. Not Instagram side hustles, moonlighting in the survival sense. Before 2008, Gen X had higher rates of secondary income than any other generation. Rental properties, consulting gigs, freelance work, small businesses. Not because they were entrepreneurial visionaries, because they'd watched corporate loyalty mean nothing when layoffs came. When unemployment spiked to 10%, Gen X had options. Lose your corporate job? The consulting clients are still there. Company downsizes, the rental income doesn't stop. They could weather unemployment without touching retirement accounts. They didn't have to sell investments at the worst possible time. Again, not luck. Preparation, 30 years of preparing for systems to fail. Let's get specific about what Gen X actually did in 2008. They kept paying mortgages on underwater houses. They'd mapped it to completion on spreadsheets and knew panic selling would lock in the loss forever. They maintained or increased 401k contributions. While everyone else was reducing retirement savings, Gen X saw the market down 50% and thought, everything's on sale. They kept emergency funds untouched. That's literally what they're for. Job loss in a recession is the textbook definition of emergency. They bought index funds. If you don't trust any company or advisor, buy everything. Let the market sort it out. They stayed off CNBC. Panic porn doesn't help spreadsheets. They activated backup plans. Side hustles became primary income. Multiple streams meant flexibility. And the most Gen X thing, they kept paper records. When digital systems failed and banks collapsed, they had physical documentation. Redundancy by design. So what happened to Gen X's paranoid strategy? By 2024, those who stayed invested saw returns that made up for the crash and then some. The S&P 500 went from 666 at the March 2009 bottom to over 4,700 by 2024. But more than that, every assumption Gen X made proved true. Banks failed. Pensions evaporated. Government bailouts went to institutions, not people. Gen X came out the other side with their retirement accounts intact and growing. University of Michigan researchers found that Gen Xers who lived through all three crashes had fundamentally different investment psychology. Multiple exposures created calibrated risk assessment, the ability to distinguish between temporary volatility and permanent loss. Translation: Gen X learned the difference between scary and actually dangerous. 2008 was terrifying. But it wasn't permanently dangerous to a diversified portfolio with a 20-year timeline. So here's what 2008 actually was for Gen X. Confirmation. Confirmation that their anxiety was rational, that their backup plans were necessary, that their distrust of institutions was justified. They didn't panic because they'd been expecting disaster since they were 8. They didn't sell because they'd built the financial infrastructure to weather collapse. They didn't trust the experts because they'd watched experts fail their parents. 2008 didn't teach Gen X to save or diversify. They already knew all of that. 2008 just proved they were right. Your money habits aren't random. They're responses to the world that shaped you. And Gen X's response to 2008 makes perfect sense. If you lived through 2008, drop a comment about what you actually did. Did you panic or did you buy? Remember, that Gen Xer who kept investing through the crash wasn't brave. They were prepared. There's a difference, and that difference made millionaires.